Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with Developer University. For more of my training videos for beginners, please visit me at devu.com. In this lesson, we're going to focus on iteration statements and a specific iteration statement, the for next iteration statement. Now, sometimes you're just going to need to loop or iterate through a block of code. You're going to need to iterate through a sequence of items and maybe to perform a series of checks until you find a successful match, maybe to execute the same code a number of times, just because that's part of your business rules, whatever the case might be. Actually, you'll find yourself doing this more than you might anticipate. And while it may not seem all that practically useful at first, trust me, you're going to need this in your toolbox as you start to write more interesting applications. So let's create a new project, and we're going to call this for next iterations, and click OK. And the syntax is really simple. And I'm willing to bet that you're able to figure out what this will do without me telling you what it does. So here we go. All right, there we go. That's all we need. So can you guess what you're going to see in the console window whenever we run the application? Let's see if you're right. Okay, so if you guessed that you would see the numbers 1 through 10 printed out into a console window, you're right. All right, so basically all we're doing is executing the block of code defined by the for and the next statements, in this case in lines 5 and 7. Anything between the for and the next will get executed a number of times until we've reached a certain condition. In this case, we're going to start off with the value 1 and assign 1 to index. But once we get to assigning the number 10 to index, that'll be the last time we iterate through the code defined inside of the code block between the for and the next. And then we break out. And here we, in line number 9, we wait for the end user to respond that they have actually seen the content that we printed to screen, and that's pretty much all there is to it. So we're instructing Visual Basic to execute a block of code a number of times, and once we've completed that sequence of times as defined by this higher end boundary, then we'll break out of the for next loop iteration statement and move on to the rest of our code. All right. So inside of here, we can do some interesting things. So like, for example, what if I were to go if index equals 7, I could do something like then console.writeLine, found 7, like so, and we could run this. And then once we get to the number 7, we can print that out. I have an idea. Why don't we shorten this just a little bit? Like before, I don't think I showed you the then portion of the if, else statement, but you can use the then in order to combine everything on a single line like so. All right. So the then will allow you to combine a simple check with a result. If index equals 7 is true, then go ahead and perform this line of code. So we're able to condense 3 lines of code into 1 line of code. And now when we run it, we get the exact same results. Okay, I just wanted to show you that little use of the then keyword. Great. And what if, though, let's comment that out. What if, and let's bust back over here to if index equals 7, console.writeLine found 7. And now, at this point, we found what we were looking for. What if we wanted to break out of this loop? We're no longer searching for the value. We found what we were looking for. We could do something like exit 4. Okay. And so now when we run the application, the result looks a little bit different. We get to 7. We found 7, and now we exit out of the for statement, and we continue on executing our lines of code. Great. This might be a good time to talk about one of the features of Visual Studio. And again, I'm trying not to talk about Visual Studio, but you still need some tools in your toolbox if we're going to build applications. And one of those tools are the debugging tools of Visual Studio, which is probably one of the best reasons to use Visual Studio. You can actually pause and watch the execution of each line of code by simply setting a stop sign or a breakpoint in your code. And then when we execute the code and we get to that breakpoint, then we can continue to step through the code line by line or continue on and allow it to continue to execute the lines of code. So to set a breakpoint, it's really easy in Visual Studio. There's actually a number of different ways to do it, but I find that the easiest way is to find this little gray column off to the left-hand side underneath the tab heading and just click in that column for the line of code that you want to set a breakpoint on. So in this case, I want to set a breakpoint on line number 6, so I just click in the little gray area next to 6, and it creates this little stop sign over here on the left. I guess it's a circle. It looks more like an octagon to me. And then it highlights the rest of that row in red. And so now whenever we go to run the application and we're in debug time, we're actually, the execution of the application has stopped. Now, unfortunately, I got this little window that popped up and I gotta get rid of that. Move it down, but you can see that in this case the line of execution has stopped here on line number 6, and what we can do is hover our mouse cursor over the variables. In this case there's only one variable, but if I hovered over in this case the variable index, we can see its current value, and I can click what was formerly the start button. It's now the continue button, and when I run it and hover my mouse cursor over, you can see that index has increased to 2. So when I clicked continue, it executed the next several lines of code, came back up to the top, and we were able to break again on that same line of code since we're just iterating through the same block. Now I can use keyboard shortcuts, or I can use these little items here in the toolbar while we're in debug mode to step through our code. Now I'm going to ignore the step into and the step out of. They're kind of special cases and not really essential to us until we start building more complex applications. But the step over is probably what we want to use. So I'm just going to hit this step over or F10 button on my keyboard. And here I can just begin to step through each single line of code. And I can continue to evaluate what the values are. I can look at this autos window or the locals window, or even the watch window, and see the value of variables. So in this case, index is one of the local variables, and I can see it here, its name and its value. And as it changes value, notice that as we executed that for loop in line number 5, the value turned from a black font to a red font, indicating that the previous line of code changed the value of that variable. All right, so that's just a little visual cue to let us know that something just changed in our application. Let's see what else we can do here. If I have a specific variable that I want to keep an eye on, I can kind of highlight it and then drag and drop it into a watch window, so that even if I am moved off to another part of the program, I can always keep an eye on the current value of the index in one of the watch windows. All right. So the other thing that you can do, which is kind of neat, is hover your mouse cursor over and see the current value of any given variable. And I can even pin this down. So notice that when I did that, it created this little pinned area, and I can actually drag it and move it around so that as I start stepping through the code, that little window pops up here. And you might have seen it briefly change color to red whenever we hit the index 6. And I'm going to continue moving on through our code here. And at this point, we'll see that index will in fact equal 7. So we'll step into our if code block, execute the console.write line, and then we'll see what happens when we hit the exit 4. It jumped from line number 10 all the way to line number 14. And if we hit continue now, we'll just see this console window, and we're back in runtime, and I can hit the enter key on the keyboard to continue. All right, so those are just a really, really quick overview of the features. There is one cool feature that I want to show you that's applicable here since we're working with iteration statements, and that is we can configure our breakpoint by clicking the little gear wheel that appears as we hover our mouse cursor over our breakpoint. And I can say that I only want to break on this line under certain conditions. And the condition that I want to break on is whenever index equals 7. So whenever we hit that point, I'm going to say, let the breakpoint stop the execution of the code. Otherwise, let's just go ahead and blow our way through 1 through 6. And so now I hit the continue button. Let's hover our mouse cursor over our index, or we can just see it off here to the right-hand side. It is, in fact, 7. I'm done with that now. I could say I want to keep an eye on this and just keep that around, or I can actually just get rid of the whole thing by just clicking the little X button there. All right, but you see how I was able to configure this breakpoint and make it conditional so that it only stops whenever the index value is equal to 7. And there's some other options here that I could choose. For example, I could log a message when we hit a certain situation and then continue the execution. We're not going to do any of that right now, but notice this little tab, breakpoint settings, pops up inline. Very, very neat. And we can continue on. The last thing that I want to show you, and you can see that the icon has changed from just a red, I guess it's a circle, but it looks kind of to me like an octagon. But notice that whenever I change some of the settings, it has a white plus symbol in the middle of it. Let's go ahead and turn off that. But what I do want to do, say I want to disable the breakpoint temporarily because it's not useful to me at the moment. So let me just run the application. The breakpoint is still there, but we're ignoring it for this run of our application, and then I can enable it one more time or get rid of it altogether by clicking on it a second time. And any of the things that I did here, I'd be able to also do from the debug window, where I'm able to toggle breakpoints, create new breakpoints, even make them functional breakpoints, changing their settings about when they should actually be enacted, delete or disable the breakpoints, and so on. Okay, so let's go ahead and get rid of that, save that. All right, so I also wanted to show you something cool. Another feature of Visual Studio, since we're on this topic and we've got some time. I'm going to go ahead and, well, we'll just leave everything where it's at. Here, what I want to do is show you how to use code snippets. And if you can't remember how to use an if statement or how to use a for statement or any of the other things that we're going to learn about, typically what you can do is just type the first word. Even if you don't remember the exact syntax, you can type in for, tab, and bam, it expands it out and creates a code snippet. I can continue to tab my way through and notice that there are 3 fields that I'm tabbing between, and they're all kind of in this goldenrod or yellow color. And this will allow me to change, for example, the variable name that's used as the iterator variable. So I can change it from index just to the letter I. I can change it from 1 to, let's say, we'll start at the number 3 and we'll go to the number 13 instead. And when I've finished replacing the various parts of this for statement, I can hit the enter key on the keyboard, and now I can continue on in writing the rest of my statement here. So in this case, it would just be I. Let me comment this all out, change my mind on that, and there you go. Now we're going from 3 to 13 instead of 1 to 10. All right. And another interesting thing I can do is to actually go and here, let me show you one more thing. We'll just go if tab, and here you can see that I'm checking, in this case, the only thing to replace is that conditional check. What are we going to evaluate, whether it's true or false? We just make that change there. So I equals, 3 or whatever the case might be. Let's put that in the context of this. So if tab, I equals 4, enter, and now we can continue on in here and write whatever we want to write logic-wise. So those are code snippets, another feature of Visual Studio. The final thing I want to show you about the for next statement is that you can step backwards. So if I wanted to go from 13 to 3, I could do that, but unfortunately, if you just leave it like I wrote it, it's not going to give you any satisfaction. What you need to do is actually add a keyword called step. And so I can step backwards through a for statement by saying step -1. And we can do the step to do some interesting things. Here I'm going from 13 to 3. Okay, that's cool. Let's go forward, tab, tab. And here we'll go from 1 to 10, but we're going to step 2. And we'll do console.writeLine. So here we're just going to, index. We're going to start with 1 and then we're going to step 2 until we get to 10. So let's run this. And basically this gives us the ability to count odd numbers. So we print out 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. We hit 10, we break out of the for loop. So that's our ability to step 2 numbers at a time and essentially avoiding all the evens. Okay, so there's a lot of options here. Again, in this lesson, we talked about quite a few things. We talked about the for next iteration statement and how it will automatically allow us to iterate through a block of code a number of times as defined by the conditions here. And we are assigning the current value of the iterator of the variable that will hold the current index from one number to another number. All right, so and that will define the number of times. We can obviously step backwards by using a negative step or step over numbers by using 2, 3, 10, whatever it is that we want to use. We're able to use the if and then keyword in order to do a really quick conditional statement all in one line of code. We use the debugging tools and even conditional debugging, disabling debugging, stepping through lines of code, all of that. We looked at code snippets that allow us to generate lots of code, a little template of code that we can then go through, use the tab key to change various values. So we looked at a lot of cool little features here in a relatively short amount of time. Let's continue on. We're doing great. And hopefully you're gaining confidence in your ability to write code using Visual Basic because I know at this point now we can do some pretty interesting things. So let's continue on in the next video. We'll see you there. Thank you.